But first, for more than 30 years, Kenneth Walsh has been the White House correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. He has seen a lot, but not as much as the people he writes about in his new book, Ultimate Insiders, White House Photographers and How They Shape History.
Walsh focuses on the official White House photographers. They photograph the presidents and their families in public and private, in times of crisis and times of play. And those images help shape how we end up thinking about our presidents, because those photographers have extraordinary access.
They see just about everything that happens in a public way, and the presidents trust them. So getting to see the presidents through their observations, both verbal and, I've interviewed many of them, and through their visual chronicles, gives us an interesting perch from which to see the presidents.
So many of the real up-close and personal photos, the ones that really give us a sense of emotion, they're not taken by photographers for the news organizations. Right. They're taken by that White House photographer who has access that the others do not. How much access do those White House photographers
They have amazing access.
It varies from president to president.
It varies, but and that's an important distinction to make, because the book I've just published is about basically White House staff photographers, a big distinction from the news photographers who don't have the access that the staff people do. The staff people, if they play their cards right, when I've talked to many of them, they have basically the same explanation. To do their jobs well, they need to be good photographers, but they need to have the trust of the president. And that to get the access, or else they're just left with the public stuff that the news photographers get, and that's not very good.
The famously photogenic John F. Kennedy was the first president to have an official White House photographer.
He was.
Since then, every president has had one, Kennedy through Trump. Whose photographer took the most compelling images? Who had the great access? Who got the best shots?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. Jimmy Carter, by the way, did not name a chief photographer. A big mistake, because how many of those up-close and personal pictures of Carter do we remember? Almost none, because he didn't have somebody who he gave the trust to. He didn't want that to happen, and it didn't. But as far as who did the best job, who came up with the best pictures, it was really Kennedy. He would say to the photographers who took his picture, when I have my kids with me, you can't miss with these pictures. And he was right, and everybody knew that. If he gave you the access, especially with the children, that was going to be gold for the photographers, for the staff photographers, and then they'd distribute them to the media. But Kennedy hired the first chief photographer, Cecil Stoughton, who was an Army photographer, and he came into the White House. But he also gave access to outside photographers who he trusted. A guy named Jacques Lowe, who was a famous foreign-born photographer based in New York, had wonderful pictures of Kennedy. Stanley Tredick, who worked for the glossy photo magazines and got his photographs out with them. But the pictures of Kennedy, they're so interesting and compelling, and that was part of his political approach.
Sometimes there is a tension, and the presidents will say to the photographer, beat it, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, famously, President Nixon had a rule, 6 and out. His photographer, a guy named Ollie Atkins, who he really didn't get along that well with and didn't really trust, what 6 and out meant was that he would listen for the frames being clicked off. When he heard 6 of them being clicked off on the camera, Ollie had to leave. And so you didn't get a lot of those private pictures of Nixon, too. And some of them actually did exist. But Nixon didn't trust the photographer that much, and it showed. Other photographers, another photographer who was a fabulous photographer, and all the subsequent photographers credit him with being a real pathbreaker, was Lyndon Johnson's photographer, a guy named Yoichi Okamoto, a Japanese-American who pioneered the idea of the White House staff photographer being a storyteller, not just a guy who took snaps of the pictures of meet and greet type of things, but telling stories with the pictures. And he was a fabulous photographer, and his successors credit him with really defining that role.
You know a lot about the presidency, the White House, the history. What surprised you in writing this book?
The thing that surprised me was how the relationships mattered so much, and how different photographers were able to get access in different ways, but understanding that it was the relationships that they built did that. Cecil Stoughton, who we talked about, who worked for Kennedy, went through the children. He actually taught John Jr. how to use his cameras. And so whenever little John saw Cecil coming in, he would say, "Oh, bring him, I want to play with his cameras, and so he got pictures that way. Now, more recently, President Obama had a fabulous relationship with his photographer, Pete Souza, who also worked for Ronald Reagan, and then came back, the only photographer to work for 2 presidents.
Let's talk about the lasting legacy. What do these photographs taken by the White House official photographers, what is the lasting imprint that they will make? What will they tell us about these presidencies?
Well, it will be, of course, different for each one, but you do get a distinct picture, literally, of each president through the eyes and lenses of the photographers. And some of it is what we expect publicly. Kennedy, the charismatic, charming, new age leader. President Obama, the sort of the guy who was also charismatic in his own way and very accessible and that sort of thing. So you get different approaches from different photographers, but in the end, if the photographer is allowed to have the access and do the job properly, you really do get a compelling visual history. And that's what you can find in the National Archives and at the presidential libraries. And a lot of people ask me, well, how do we get to see these pictures and even get them? Well, there are pictures. We're the taxpayers, and we paid for them, so there are. So you can go to the libraries and look through the records and get the pictures for yourself.
There is a great story told in the book by David Kennerly, who was the official photographer in the Ford White House. Kennerly covered a meeting in which President Ford instructed some generals and diplomats to go to Vietnam on a fact-finding mission. As they left, Kennerly told the president he would like to go to Vietnam to photograph the trip. The president said, okay. Kennerly said, one problem, they're leaving right now, and I don't have any money. President Ford pulled out his wallet, reached inside, handed Kennerly $47 and said, it's all I've got, take it. Kennerly did and went off on the trip.
What a great story. Of the many people who've served as White House photographers, one came from Maine. Samantha Appleton grew up in Camden and was staff photographer during the first term of President Obama.
We talked with Samantha Appleton in 2013 after she had left that job, and I asked her about what she missed about it.
There are times when I miss it more, and there are times when I don't miss it, when there are situations that pop up, political situations that pop up, and I feel for my colleagues and what they're going through.
What do you miss about the job? What was exhilarating about that work?
Well, I miss the family, to tell you the truth. More than anything, I miss just being able to see the president and the first lady and the daughters. I didn't see the daughters as much, but certainly saw the president and the first lady on a daily basis. And they're such wonderful people, just as people that to be around them every day, and then all of a sudden, I can't call them up and go have a coffee.
When you look back at the photos that you took at that time, what sort of stands out in your head?
I think the quiet moments, you get wrapped up in the, oh, this is an important picture about what they're trying to do with healthcare, or this is an important picture about Libya or whatever is going on, in that period of time, or the oil spill in the Gulf. No one even talks about that anymore, but for that summer, it took up, a lot of bandwidth in the White House. And you can't get wrapped up in that. Even in the time, I try to remind myself, although you need to do this for your job, to document it for the archive, try to remember it's those little moments, the military aid waiting off to the side, things like that don't make the light of day. And even my photos that don't make the light of day, they go into the archive, and to try to remember those historically, 50 years out, those are just as important.
How many thousands upon thousands of shots did you take in the White House?
I took 211,000 pictures. When I was leaving, I was, kind of going through to try to remember what I had there, because I can't look at them again now that I've left. That's it. It's, it's not my property. It's our property, but I can't look at it again. So I went through, and it's 211,000 pictures.
That's a lot of photos.
No 6 and out policy there.
No, indeed.
You can see more of Samantha's work on her website, SamanthaAppleton.com, and you can see thousands upon thousands of presidential photos on the websites of the National Archives and the Presidential Libraries, all fun places to browse. Every president since Herbert Hoover has a presidential library.